Okay. Okay, well, please keep going ahead and getting pizza, but I want to give our terrific guests a chance to talk to you, and you have a chance to talk to them, because I was just telling Alexander and Philippe that I've had a chance to hear some about what they're doing, and it's really quite fascinating and potentially, I think, quite revolutionary for how we think about the legal profession, its traditional categories and divisions. In any event, my name is David Wilkins. I'm the faculty director of the Center on the Legal Profession, and this is our weekly speaker series in which we try to bring you the most interesting and cutting-edge things that we know about that are happening in the legal profession, and this is definitely one. So they told me not to read their extensive biography, so I won't, in order that there'll be more time for discussion, but let me just say we're very delighted to have Alexander Gavis, who is a Senior Vice President and Deputy General Counsel in the Corporate Legal Department at Fidelity, and then Philippe Maudlin is Managing Director within Fidelity Center of Applied Technology, a unit of Fidelity Investments. And as I said, they are doing some very, very exciting stuff. So, gentlemen, please.
Great. Well, thank you, David. So it's very nice to be here. We're going to take probably about 35, 40 minutes and talk a little bit about some of the innovation work that we're doing, and then we'll open up for questions. Maybe what we thought might make sense is for us to take a couple minutes and just tell you a little bit about ourselves from a practical standpoint, less from the resume standpoint. I am an attorney, and I work at Fidelity Investments, as David mentioned. But my background is really a regulatory background. I clerked for a year, and then I worked at the SEC in Washington, and have primarily started out as sort of a regulatory attorney. But I also started out right as the internet and email was starting to explode. And I had some computer training in college. I took some computer programming classes, and I owned the TRS-80 when I was 12 years old, if you know what that is, that device is. That really sparked my interest, and I kind of got involved at the ground floor in thinking about e-commerce and internet law issues. And one thing led to another, and I wound up in Boston working at Fidelity, and I've been there 19 years. And I've really worked at the company on a tremendous number of issues related to e-commerce, all the way from starting up, how do we start up an internet site, how do we even just communicate with our investors, how do we move a lot of our content to the web, but then getting into social media issues more recently, mobile commerce issues, virtual currency issues or virtual assets. And more recently, what we're going to talk about today around human-centered design. So that's my background. I'm going to have Philippe introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Alex. Good afternoon. So I'm Philippe, and I work, as David mentioned, in a part of Fidelity. It's called Fidelity Center of Applied Technology. And our mission is to create new businesses for Fidelity, in essence, focusing on driving new revenue for the firm. So we are like the R&D arm of Fidelity, and my specific role in that is as a coach. We have these incubators that we run, and we run them like small startups, but they're not about creating new washing machines or new Apple phones. They're about generating new businesses within the financial services industry. How might we think about the financial services differently, and therefore bring opportunity to enhance our brand? So right now we have 8 of these incubators, we call them, running at one time. And my job is a coach, to help coach these teams through the process, the innovation process, to either park the idea, pivot the idea, or pursue the idea, right? So I've been with Fidelity for close to going on to 18 years. My background is the traditional product management and marketing. I've held CMO roles in various financial services firms, and then been with Fidelity for about 19 years. So Alex and I have been fortunate to work with Alex in the capacity in this innovation space and working in the need that we have from a a legal standpoint to figure out what we can and cannot do. So Alex and I partnered in this innovation and you'll see later, where we found opportunity in the legal space to explore this whole notion of human-centered design.
Thanks, Philippe. So, you know, in my years of practice, I've worked with a lot of really innovative people, and particularly folks like Philippe. And there have been many developments. You know, Six Sigma was one, the lean startup, the concept of sort of making processes more efficient. But it really wasn't until maybe about 4 years ago that a new concept came along that really made me start thinking about applying this new concept to the legal profession and sort of how we as lawyers and providers of services can actually provide these services in a different way. And it made me ask a couple of different questions. And the questions and the thoughts that I had were around sort of how we provide legal services. And in particular, what if we could explain complex legal concepts and really know that our clients understand what we're saying? Really know that they understand what we're saying. What if we could draft legal agreements and know that the clients or the consumers who are reading those legal agreements, for example, the ones maybe you're clicking through on a website or on a mobile phone, that the folks who are reading them really comprehend what it is that we're saying? What if we present arguments to judges and juries and know that they're really with us, that they really kind of get it, that they're not just sort of figuring these are lawyers talking to us, but I understand what this person is saying? Or what if we could determine how we as lawyers learn and then design classes around how we learn as opposed to how maybe the process has developed over the years in terms of the law school curriculum? So I started asking these questions, and the reason why I started asking these questions is because I started to participate in a new area of thinking that our business folks have embraced and incorporated into our business processes. And it's called human-centered design, or design thinking, as maybe you've heard about it. And there's been a lot written about it. Particularly, there are actually some places like the Stanford University has a design school, or a school of design. But there are also a number of different organizations such as ours that are embracing this and bringing it in-house and working through it. And attorneys like myself are supporting business people in this venture. And I'm starting to think about it as a process that we can bring to the law itself or to the way we practice. So what is human-centered design? Well, it starts actually with thinking about the end user, thinking about the consumer of a service, thinking about the consumer of some type of product. And it starts with trying to understand what that person's needs are. Really empathizing, really putting yourself in their shoes, and starting to identify problems or issues that that person may need to overcome. And then it moves to stepping back and starting to think about how you might be able to create some solutions or design some helpful products or services that could actually help that person overcome some of those problems. But it's not thinking from the top down, from a group of people sitting around and saying, what do we think consumers want, or what do we think clients want? But it's starting with the research about the clients, understanding them, maybe visiting them in their own native environment, interviewing them, spending time with them, observing them, and then bringing those concepts back and in a collaborative group, designing maybe some solutions. And I say maybe because they may not be the right solutions, but brainstorming and coming up with solutions that potentially could work. rapidly working together as a group, collaborating, and then essentially having a sort of bias towards action, which is designing some prototypes, designing some ideas, designing some potential solutions that could work, but testing them, going back to the consumer, going back to the client, saying, would this work? Try it out. And then working with them, co-collaborating with those individuals, so that ultimately there's an iterative process that happens. And at the end of the process, there's something that's designed that may actually help to solve a problem. And we like to say, actually, when we're working, and it's sort of a mantra that we say, which is, fall in love with the problem, not the solution. Falling in love with the problem, not the solution. And that's very hard for lawyers sometimes to say, or to think, because we are very results-oriented. We get a set of facts, and we like to find a solution for those facts. And we like to use our intellectual abilities. But this is a different process, and Philippe's going to take us through some of the way in which we've implemented this process, and it's different than the way we typically learn as lawyers. So hang on for the ride. Philippe?
All right, thank you, Alex. So before I jump into all of us solving the problem, I wanted to take a step back and talk to you about how we think about innovation at Fidelity. There are many frameworks that are used today to talk about innovation, and what I have on the slide here is one framework that works, and you can read tons of books, and there's all levels of innovation. But we look at this framework in two areas. One, how is it that we're going to win, right? And then where are we going to play? So you think about how we're going to win. What is it that we're going to bring to market in order to win, right? And then which markets are we going to play in? So this is very much from a business lens, but think of this from a legal standpoint, right? How might you look at the innovation that you foresee in this type of framework, right? On those two axes. So then we begin to look at it from the standpoint of, as a business, we look at innovation in three different areas. What's core, what's transformational, and then what's adjacent. So what's core is, we've got a retail business. They're focused on providing guidance or products to individuals, and they need to continually improve the services that they provide today, right? So it's core to our business. We're serving 31 million customers at Fidelity with a lot of people, a lot of services, and a lot of products. How do we continue to innovate and improve that core through incremental improvement, right? Then you move to the space of much more adjacent innovation. And this is where you start pushing up into potentially new markets or new products, still within the, as we call it, financial services space, right? So if you think about that from the standpoint of, if you were in a law firm and you were practicing, and how might you begin to look at this? What might be adjacent to the services that I provide today that gives me access to new markets or new products, right? Where we as a firm might play and how might we play, right? And then there's transformation that, there's innovation that's transformational, right? That means we flip everything up on its head and we go out and we produce washing machines because they're relevant to our customers and we could drive revenue. I'm making that up, right? But more on the extension where you really reinvent your business model. At Fidelity and what Alex and I are involved in, we're at the upper end of this adjacency. We started where we were playing here, and this is very important. to think about this, because this is where you practice. Because it's not like, in a large corporation, you learn the process of innovation. And now we're playing more up with this upper end. We're moving into new markets and thinking about new products, right? So as you think about your profession, how might you think about what you're up to in this type of framework? Okay? Thank you. Alex? Nope. Nope.
We keep going in the wrong direction.
Right. So I know what I'm going to do on the train ride home with Alex is teach him how to use arrows. So I wanted to bring it to life a little bit. Alex and I, this is when we started working on this about 4 years ago. The chairman of our firm at one of the annual meetings made the statement that, we've done a wonderful job as a company helping people accumulate wealth. Right? We serve over 31 million customers. They're doing a great job. We need to pay attention and make sure that we're doing everything possible to help them protect those assets. So you hear something like that at an annual meeting and everybody's ears stand up and say, oh, he wants us to go do. Right? So a lot of decks were created around product opportunity and what might we do, and the answer came back out is like, we need a new trust system so that our getting a trust product is very easy to do, and that will help customers and that will protect them, right? So we were given the opportunity to explore this space as well. So if you'd taken the traditional route of solutioning, which that's what just happened, right? Was, we sat around, we need a new trust system, so let's go build a new technology to produce trust, right, for customers. We flipped that on its head and said, you know what, let's go talk to people about this first. So we have a process that we go through, which is empathy, prototyping, and piloting. In the empathy part of what we do, we focus on that problem. What is the customer problem that we're trying to solve? So we went out there, we sat down with customers in their homes, and we talked to them about getting a trust. And what we found right off is people like, wait a minute, trust? What am I trying to do? So I'm going to speed you up in the process. And what we really found was the problem that customers were trying to solve, they wanted to protect their assets and their families. That's the problem that they wanted solved. It wasn't that, I need a new trust. So you think about what that means from the standpoint of solutioning. If I want to protect my asset and my families, that doesn't mean all I need is a trust, right? So that was a huge discovery from the standpoint, if we had gone out and spent millions to create a new trust system, we actually weren't solving the problem of consumers. In fact, when we were going through the prototyping, we actually took, the application to get a trust to people, and they were like pushing back from the table going, why am I filling this out now? I don't understand what's its purpose. Why am I trying to do that? So we just saved the firm millions of dollars, and also we really identified what's the core of the problem of the customer. So at that stage then, we moved into prototyping. And what I mean by, so when we were doing empathy work up front to define that problem, we probably spent a month interviewing customers, about 15 to 20 families in their homes. That's all it took. You spend 2 hours in someone's home with obviously a detailed agenda, you gain a lot of information. So that was enough there talking to those 20 or so families to understand what that problem is. Then we move into prototyping. And prototyping means we're going to go in, we heard all kind of information from these customers, we're going to go in with pieces of paper, as you can see this gentleman's hands here, and we're going to have things sketched out, we're going to put a pen in the customer's hands, and we're going to co-develop with them. And by co-developing with them, we find out a lot of information. You go into somebody's home and you have a husband and wife together, and you're talking to them about, at this time, protecting their family and their assets, and they're sitting on the couch, and you start asking a lot of questions, showing them prototypes of how might they, what's their process of thinking, and then the husband, they're telling you what their needs are and how things work in their house, and the husband says, oh, I'm going to show you a example of some information that really is helpful for me, and he gets up and he walks into the study to get that information, and the wife then tells you, that's actually not what's happening, right? That is unbelievably powerful, right? Now, how could you do that without being in the consumer's home, listening to them, observing their behavior? I mean, when we go into people's homes, we say, so where do you do your work? And they take us into their kitchen where there's a desk and there's a computer on it, and they say, well, this is where I have my statements and I have all this. To watch that and to understand that, you learn so much about the consumer. So how might you, as you're beginning to solve for clients, think in that manner from the standpoint they're making decisions in their homes, right? So we went through 3 major pivots while we were going through this prototyping. The first was people had no idea what the process was to build an estate plan. No idea. Second thing is, they thought it was for the ultra wealthy. Even people with $5, $6, $7 million did not think an estate plan was for them. And the third was, felt it was extremely expensive. On average, consumers thought it was anywhere between $12,000 and $15,000 to get an estate plan. All of that's not true, right? But this is what they thought. That's why only 34% of people have a living will. They were stuck. So that's the first pivot. We found that information out. The second pivot was we took in forms and we thought, hey, you know what, we'll create all this online and we can do it. We don't need attorneys. We can just make this happen. LegalZoom on steroids. When we got into the process with consumers, they got to the end and they pushed back from the table and they said, whoa, wait a minute, I don't know what I don't know. Back comes the attorney. All right? But if we had not been in those people's homes, walking them through the process, watching them work, and actually seeing them push back from the table and go, wait a minute, I'm not done, because what else is there that I don't know? So we brought the attorney back into the process. And the third big pivot that we found out is the majority of people, when they complete the estate plan, never execute the instruction letter that comes with it. So the thing's no good, right? So we had to build a process where you take the instruction letter and actually help the consumer execute it. Now, there are attorneys out there that help with that. I'm not saying it doesn't have, I'm talking about the majority of people. But again, if we weren't in people's homes, watching them work and co-developing with them, we would have never learned this. And then the last piece of our process is to pilot it. So we prototype with anywhere between 20 and 50 25 and 50 families here. Right? Not that many, but boy, do you learn a lot when you're spending that much time with consumers. And again, nothing digital at this point, all on paper. Right? People are moving Post-its around, they're designing things, they're changing things around, they change our process. We lay out a process that looks like A through Z. They switch it all around, saying this works better for me, right? But that enables us to really understand what's there. Then we run a pilot. And that pilot is where we take what we learned, we digitize it, and then we would run it with between 100 and 500 people. Right? So through the process that Alex talked about, that's what we did for the consumer. But there was a big finding from an attorney standpoint, our attorneys and their needs.
Well, and what Philippe is talking about and the steps and the pivots that he mentioned are really not necessarily pivots that are business pivots. He's talking about how estate planning lawyers really interact with clients. The fact of the matter is, people go to estate planning lawyers to actually get a will or a trust or whatever set up. And if they don't understand the process, or if they don't really know what is involved, or if they don't really know how to fund ultimately and rearrange their assets, that's a problem. So he wasn't necessarily sort of coming up completely with this brand new business process or this brand new business concept. He was actually taking a lens and looking at the estate planning practice area and saying, what happens in it? Do people understand what's going on? And many people are outside of it because it's intimidating for them. They don't understand it. They think it's expensive. They think it's hard to interact with attorneys. So one of the ideas that we've been working on is how to sort of on-ramp people into the process, how to make it easier for them to get into the process. And that involved actually talking with estate planning practices, talking about how they collect information, how they interact with their clients on that initial engagement, where they get the information from, what are the kind of forms that they're asking people to fill out, and can we be helpful with that? Can we help people to be educated about what the process is and how to get into it? And so that was a terrific, I think, combination of both business process and business, identifying problems, but really also looking at the legal practice area and coming up with some good solutions.
One last thing I'd add to this is we were working with clients as they were going to the attorney. The number one area we found why parents don't complete the estate planning process is when the attorney asks them the question, who do you want to be the guardian of your children? And everything stops. And the attorney says, oh, well, if you want, you could go sit in the next room next door and you guys can discuss it. Whoa, that's a big question. So one of the big learnings out of this is how might we prepare people, have them sit in the comfort of their own home, understand the process, and make some big decisions before they go in and get the questions asked to them. Because they can have the rational, emotional discussions at home versus, oh man, we're on the clock here and we got to make a decision and got to do that. So again, back to why it's important in going through the process.
And what we were doing here was not looking at the substantive law of estate planning or an estate planning bar and saying, okay, what are the sort of legal substantive issues here? We were looking at sort of human processes and the sort of human-centered approach to getting into the legal process. How do people get into that legal process? Because it is a process, and it does involve some fairly complicated lawyering and understanding of someone's assets. But the question is, how do people get into it? How do people perceive the estate planning process? And that's really what we were focused on.
So to take you through another quick example, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this.
Anyone have seen that?
So this is an area that we're very much focused on. And again, I'm going to get back to what Alex was talking about. If you take the notion of human-centric in the problems that they're trying to solve, right? So we're thinking about people saving for retirement, right? And sure, we can come up with tons of retirement solutions. Well, we get out there and we start talking to families and we start talking to millennials and we start talking to people that just graduated and want to get them onto a savings path and whatever. And boom, $1.3 trillion in debt gets in the way of that because they say, what do you mean? I don't have any capacity to save because I've got this. So if we weren't in there talking and really trying to uncover why people were not saving when they got out of college or even in the early 30s or whatever, and understand their thought process, we would have kept hitting the same wall. And then all of a sudden this problem came up. So we pivoted immediately and said, so how might we help? The first thing that we did to approach this, because this was the biggest need, is that there was students were, at this time, young adults were holding debt at high rates, and they had no idea how they might be able to refinance that and get a lower rate. Literally no idea that there are processes out or solutions out there that would help them consolidate loans, refinance, and do this, and had no clue they could do that, right? So we immediately approached the problem, how might we help these individuals who are sacked with this debt, at least from the standpoint of consolidation and understanding and solving for potentially a lower rate, so that one, they could maybe take the money they're spending on their student loans and potentially use it in other manners, right? And as we were getting into this and starting to work with families, the next thing that opportunity presented itself is, okay, that's at the end of the process, right? Or that's after I've taken the loan and after I've graduated. Let's go back to earlier. How about we work with students when they're in high school, and then you can even think even earlier, but let's say in high school, on affordability and fit, right? So there's a lot out there today on fit. I mean, you can get these education consultants come in your way and find the right school for you, right? But what we found when talking to families is parents don't want to tell their kids that there's constraints around the money that's available for them to go to school. They want them to excel. They want them to go to the best schools, right? So there's a hesitancy on the parent side to say, well, I'm sorry, Johnny, we can't quite do that, right? And then, so we started looking at, well, wait a minute, maybe there's an opportunity to take affordability. How might I afford this school with fit and come up with an opportunity? And it's amazing what we've been able to find, that we can bring solutions to the table that reduces the amount of debt that a student might need to take on. So I won't go into a lot of this, but this is big for us from a Fidelity standpoint in being advocates for students and for rising college students and so forth, because we know the stress that this places on families, right? Both the student and the parent. So another example of an incubation that we're going to. Yeah.
So I have a family friend who became a technical writer, and he's described, I had no idea what that meant. He said basically I got to write like instructions for things so that as many people as possible can understand what's being written. That's on one side. How do you make sure when you do this human-centered design that you're not doing human-centered design for a particular type of person, a particular type of family? Because I think it may not be a problem for you, but in a micro sense, in a macro sense, it could be very problematic.
Absolutely. So one of the things in the space of innovation is you need to, one, focus on a specific problem very narrowly, and you need to start with a target market, because you can't solve for 250 million people in the United States all at once. You've got to pick somewhere to start. So let's say, so in the early phases of empathy, we understand the landscape of who we're trying to solve for. So we're solving for 4 different major personalities, let's say, that exist. I'm simplifying things here. And we understand that. But we say to get started, I got to start with this one right here, because I can't solve it. And as we learn here, then we broaden it out to the next audience. So that's how we take the approach. So because you cannot solve for everyone at first. You've got to pick a specific target and be very, very focused on who that might be.
And you pick that based on what?
Our empathy work that we've done. So when we go out and interview families, we're learning, let's say, or interviewing high school students, right, or families of high school students who are learning about the different type that exist, right? And then as we solve, we get bigger and bigger and bigger in understanding the broader universe, right? Because if we go out with a solution that is going to solve for everybody, it'll be too watered down, right? And I'm glad to have further. It's complicated. It's very hard. It's not a slam dunk thing.
But one further thought on that is that so if you're, let's assume for a second you're in an estate planning practice. Well, you probably have a certain characteristic of clientele that's coming to talk to you. You could start there. If you're in an immigration practice, you probably have a certain group that you could figure out would be using your services more than other groups or not, and you could start there. Or you could think about sort of expanding your market or expanding your group. So maybe you know these folks who are coming to you for this particular service, but there could be a whole untapped group of people who are over here adjacent that maybe you want to interview. But to Philippe's point is, you've got to sort of focus. If you try to boil the ocean and do sort of a broad study, you're going to get sort of a lot of different inputs and not necessarily be able to come up with some actionable solutions.
Okay.
So human-centered design. So we've been talking a little bit about it. Philippe's given us some use cases that we've had from a business standpoint. But to think about it from the perspective of practice, what does it mean? Well, first off, from my perspective, if you're in a dynamic practice such as what I'm in at a big company, you're likely going to be confronted with this. You're going to have business partners, business clients like Philippe, who are going to come to you with these kind of projects. And so one thing to think about is how you're going to actually provide legal services in this environment. And from my perspective, it's fabulous because providing legal services to a dynamic project such as the ones that Philippe talked about can be a lot of fun. But it's also kind of intimidating because, as he talked about, they go through a number of different stages. And the stages involve different kind of law, interacting with consumers, figuring out different ideas and quickly prototyping and testing them, and then coming up with some of those ideas and actually moving to market quickly with them. And as an attorney practicing, whether you're in a law firm or whether you're a big corporation or maybe you're even a nonprofit that's adopting this kind of approach, you're going to have to develop some advocacy skills and legal techniques to support this. So that's one area. Another area that I think is fascinating is it could be a catalyst for changing the way we think about providing legal services, right? So we just talked about that with respect to, for example, immigration law or any kind of law like estate planning or real estate. I mean, there's lots of different practice areas that deal with clients, consumers, very actively, who are coming to you for, to address complicated legal problems. Do you really understand what they're coming to you for? Should you maybe, if you're in that kind of a practice, spend more time interviewing, figuring out the client group that you want to serve, interviewing them, going through some of the steps that we mentioned here? Maybe it'll make you a better lawyer. Maybe it'll actually make a better practice. And maybe it actually will help you in terms financially because more people will like what you're offering. So that's another area. It could be a roadmap for inward redesign of learning and work environments. So think about how you're consuming legal education right now. Is it the right way? You are the consumer here. Could you design a better process for learning legal concepts? Maybe.
Set the bar a little higher than that.
Set the bar higher than that. But I mean, think about it inwardly in terms of, also work environments. Is this the right work environment? Right? We're all sort of in this sort of very sort of structured place. The work environment that I spend most of my time with Philippe and others, is very unstructured. You know, there are tables that move around, there are stickies, there's all this sort of stuff. It's very, very collaborative. I would say that, are your classes collaborative? Are you collaborating with your peers? You may be asked to do that with business partners and actually with other legal professionals when you get out, and should you be doing it now more? So that's another area. And finally, it could be a force that can improve how policy and regulations are made. And we've been doing a little work in this area. We've been working with some of the financial regulators to say, look, designing regulations that are meant to protect consumers, designing laws that are meant to protect the populace, really fits within this model, right? Because you've got to understand what people's problems are before you can create a law that solves the problem. And so we've been experimenting a little bit with, as I mentioned, financial regulators. We've been working with another large academic institution on the West Coast. I won't name them, but and they've helped regulators sort of address some issues in this area and think a little bit more outside the box when coming up with regulations.
So on that point, what's Fidelity's approach to the new fiduciary rule? Because that's just like you mentioned, and maybe what you're referring to, it's a regulation that's sort of human-centered on the
Sure.
investment advisor conflicts.
Sure. Well, I could probably spend the rest of the class talking about, because it's a very, it's obviously a large and complicated rule. We are, I think, as any institution like ours, looking at it from multiple perspectives. I mean, obviously, how it impacts our business, but also very much so how it's going to impact our customer base. And I think you're absolutely right. It's right for this kind of analysis to think about, what does it mean from a consumer to are consumers or customers really going to understand the rule, or should we explain it to them, or do we have to give them more of a background on it? So those are some of you put your finger on it, which is, thinking about it from the customer perspective is very appropriate. So, it's true. So that ends kind of our remarks, but maybe Philippe, if you want to come up here, and we've got a question up here.
I didn't want to interrupt.
Come on up and we'll answer questions.
I have a question on how do you identify the right problem that's worth your investing in finding solutions? Because I think it's very true that at times when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
So obviously if you are a tax lawyer in a particular firm and you're dealing with particular issues, your mind, just because you're human, will always think that the solution is tax-based, but you'll be blinded. It might be a tax solution that everyone does currently, but it's really, the problem is really something that goes beyond tax. It needs a different solution. So how do you, what's the right exercise? Do you need to bring someone else in? How do you identify the problems that you're investing time into that you shouldn't? And then how do you identify the problems that you should fall in love with and start solving?
So that's a whole semester's worth of work, but you said it yourself. Is it really solving the problem of the customer? It's really about understanding what that problem is. You're so right. We do. Everything's a hammer. All right? Everything. We immediately go to solutioning. Oh, I can fix that. I can do that, right? Spending time to understand the problem and hearing that problem reoccur and talking to families or talking to clients or over and over, then you start recognizing there is a real problem that exists here today. So when Alex said the notion of spending 90% of your time on the problem, that's a mind shift, and it's hard to get there, right? And you have to train yourself not to immediately jump to solutioning. We have techniques that we use to prevent ourselves from going that, but you're changing human behavior. You're changing a guy like me who's not quite the youngest in the room, but to change my mindset, because I grew up building product, and my job was to create the hammer was to solve everything. Now the notion of approaching this and spending all my time understanding what the problem is so I can clearly articulate it, and there are ways, techniques to get to clearly articulating that problem. And it does take a lot of time, but once you have that, then you can go solve it. It becomes something else than a hammer. So you're right. There's a whole, it takes time to learn how to do that, but that's where you need to spend your time.
Well, and I guess I'd say, and this is slightly a little bit different than I think the question you're asking, but as an answer, we form mental maps all the time, and we sort of create these mental maps about how things are, and then we use those mental maps when we're thinking about the next step. So, an example is, when you're driving on the roads in Boston, there's stoplights and stop signs and everything everywhere. So think, 20, 30, 40 years down the road when we have driverless cars. Well, our mental map says there's still this sort of order in the world, so everybody should stop, but with cars that are smart and that are all interacting with each other, do we really need traffic lights? Do we really need stop signs, right? Because all the cars are able to sort themselves. But our mental map says we've got this order, and that's the order of things. And that's sort of like the tax law says we have this order, and that's the order of things, and that's what I have in my head that I'm going to now apply to this. And one of the hardest things as, I think, a practicing attorney is in some situations to get outside of that and to start to think, is there another body of law that maybe can attach to it? Is there something else that maybe is applicable here that I can kind of look to, or not even look to, but come up with a new structure? And it's hard, it's very difficult.
There's an ideation process that goes along with this. Once you define the problem, that helps you uncover these type of opportunities. But you're asking the right
Practice. Can we answer other questions?
Well, so you referred to another academic institution. I would, let me just put in a plug for design thinking, having seen successive systems models, TQM, Six Sigma, Lean. I think design thinking is the best rubric for law. So what could Harvard, what could David do to help this, because it cuts across so many places, and obviously customer-centered design is not exactly how law school works. It's advanced quite a bit since the last time I checked. So how could you sort of infuse more of this into a place like law school?
Well, to start with, I think maybe having some courses or classes focused. We do teach a class at yet another academic institution on design thinking in the law. And the funny thing is we walked into the first classroom and it was set up like this, and immediately we moved up to the business floor and to a room with all the tables. And the one thing that really resonated at the end of the day from the students who took the class is, gee, we haven't collaborated like this at all since we've come here. We've all sat in our sort of silos, and we haven't necessarily found classes that really are stretching us in that regard. And so I think to the extent that we can try to infuse maybe in some of the legal curriculum in some of the law schools, I'm sure you have some here, this approach around collaborative thinking and design, I think that can help. I mean, that's one thing. Another thing is, I think, the more articles and obviously sort of explanations of this concept that get out there. And then the other thing is to talk to some of, as you go out into practice, it's hard because law firms are set up in such a hierarchical structure, but to raise your hand and say, hey, are we thinking about this correctly? Maybe to start to talk in the practicing world about design studies. If you're in a practice, a real estate practice, for example, and you're serving all sorts of clients, are you doing the right thing? Is the process correctly? Is there maybe a need to reinvent some of the process? Maybe there's some efficiencies, maybe not. But to raise your hand and to start that dialogue at the practice level.
You do have the Harvard highlight here.
Yep.
That is, I've worked very closely with them, and they're all about this, right? So you could get exposure there and think about how to bring that in here and, so.
Well, all the students now have to take this mandatory problem-solving course, which is the whole idea of that course should be, though it's not necessarily to teach this kind of thing, to teach clinical.
But it's not a one and done thing. So take the class and you're kind of like, now you're sort of, you've got the badge. But it is, I think, a mind shift and really, working through and then sort of starting to put it into your mental map to think about problems in a different way. Doesn't have to be the only way, but when you're approaching a new idea, think about the problem a little bit differently.
And even outside the law.
Yes.
All the stuff that you're involved in outside the law.
Right.
Thinking of.
Right.
I know we were.
Can I ask, sorry.
Go ahead. No.
Is there another question? So I would argue, I'll speak your lexicon, not Harvard Law School, that Fidelity is one of the central nodes of the financial system and therefore the whole system of capitalism in the country, which is a good thing to me. So so everybody here who's listening to what you're saying is all thinking the same thing, which is this makes sense, but when I go to Wild Gotshall, they're just going to not understand all this stuff, right? So what is Fidelity doing to kind of drive this into the whole legal ecosystem through your role as an investor? Presumably, if anybody in your portfolio or PE or mutual fund, whatever, who are applying this to improve their performance, you focused on your customer, your clients, which makes total sense. What are you doing to drive this into the other end of your ecosystem?
So we have a practice within Fidelity that teaches this. And so we go across the firm and teaching, because innovation, we don't want innovation just to come from this one division of Fidelity. We want it to occur across the firm. So we teach this practice across the firm, on the asset management side of our house, to the distribution side of our house, and across. And again, to Alex's point, it's about, it's a process, right, of getting people embraced on this. But it's not easy, because there are 44,000 people at Fidelity that wake up every day to solve a customer, to serve customers, right? And to get them to step back and disrupt their process, you can understand that is not a slam dunk. Getting to your question earlier about, how do I think differently? So it's, continuous improvement, if you want to say.
So you mentioned that you're sort of like the coach of all of these little teams. Is there any emphasis when you're putting the teams together to try and bring a group of people together that have a wide range of experiences, both in and out of this sort of area, as a means of, not being so laser focused on the same type of solutions?
Absolutely. I mean, it gets back to your question, which is you don't want to always have people that are coming in with a certain hammer, right? So absolutely. In fact, you want subject matter experts, but then you don't. Because subject matter experts usually tend to lean toward what they know. But you get people that don't know. I didn't know a thing about estate plans other than I went to get one and thought it was a wicked process. But I'm not a lawyer. I didn't know anything about it, right? But I come with a different lens on solving that problem than if I was an estate planning attorney. But we had 2 estate planning attorneys working with us as we were doing this. Probably holding you guys over, right?
All right, well, if there are no other questions, thank you guys for coming in. And they'll be here for a few minutes if you want to talk to them afterwards.
Great.